Good morning, Elevate Christian Church. We are kicking off our new series today based around the second part of the Ten Commandments. We already went through the first five. We are now kicking off the second five. And to really start off this series as best we possibly can, I figure what better way than to just make fun of myself for the first 5 minutes we get to talk about the second part of the Ten Commandments. So, as my family members at least know, I am not much of a gearhead. I am not great at working on my car. Normally, I would lift up the hood of my car, and I'd just see a jumbled mess of metal and pipes, and I have no idea what those things do. Thankfully, over the last several years, I have discovered that YouTube has lots of videos to help you fix your car because I have an old, junky 2006 Mercury Montego that wants to fall apart every single day, and I don't have the time or the resources to get this fixed all the time. In fact, if you followed me anywhere, you know that I have a back brake light out. That is because the only place that I can buy a brake light is from Ford for $1,200. So that brake light is staying out. But there are other things on my car that are going out that I can fix, that I have learned to fix, that I have watched other people fix, so that I can, make sure that my car is mostly able to run on a daily basis. One of these occasions included me trying to change the brakes on my Mercury Montego. I assume the person laughing was the person that helped me change said brakes because it was a long ordeal. It was a long process. I've changed brakes on other cars before. In fact, my son's Ford Focus, I've changed the brakes on a number of times. It's really simple. I'm going to try to break this down in layman's terms for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about because I honestly don't completely know what I'm talking about. But all you've got to do to change the brakes is you take the wheel off the car. You take this little C-clamp off of this round metal disc, and inside of that little C-clamp are your brake pads. Those are very important. Those make your car stop. I have changed plenty of them where there was no more of those pads left. So I needed to change it on my Ford Focus. It was really simple. I clamped down. There's these two little pistons you've got to push in. You install the brake pads, put them back on the little metal circle, and you tighten the bolts. Done. The Mercury Montego, however, was not that simple. Myself, Robert Harlemert, kind of Jonathan, he was supervising, all helped me change the brake pads on my 2006 Mercury Montego, and it took us no less than 5 hours. Because, of course, Ford, when they made the Mercury Montego, decided that you had to have a special set of tools just to be able to push the pistons in on the C-clamp. So we spent a solid 2 hours trying to do it ourselves without buying the tools, only to realize we needed to go rent the tools from our local auto hardware store, which finally, once we did, the job went slightly quicker than it was before. We got the brakes changed. The car works. It does stop pretty well. But the maintenance was done. What we thought was going to be a simple job, because Rob has changed brake pads in his cars before, I've changed brake pads in other cars, I thought this would be a very, very simple job. Thought it may take a little bit of time, but I thought it would be simple. Turns out, working on your car is not all that simple. I did the same thing when I had to change the engine mounts on my son's car, trying to fix my car from rattling and sounding like it was going to explode. It was a job that I thought would seem simple because the people on YouTube made it look simple, but it turned out to be pretty difficult. I'm sure some of you guys can relate with me that maybe you think the simplest thing to do with your car is to take it to the dealership and let them fix it. I tend to agree with you on that now. However, there are other things in life that seem simple that actually turn out to be somewhat complicated. I think this is what we see with the Ten Commandments, to be honest, because this whole second half of the Ten Commandments is based around how we interact with other people. If you were here for the first half of the Ten Commandments, you know that it was mostly based on our relationship and how we interact with God. However, the second five is all about how we deal with the people and the relationships around us. And so we get to start off with the easiest one today. I thought we could read this and it would be really simple. I could just read it for you. The sermon would be over because hopefully we have no one in here who struggles with this. It's you shall not murder. That's number 6. So if anybody struggles with murder, I guess tell me in private. Please don't raise your hand. It's something that when I read the Ten Commandments, I see you shall not murder. Great. Check. Got that one done. Of all 10, I at least know I've got one. I'm not murdering anyone, therefore I am safe. But then, something that seems so simple as do not murder, we find Jesus seems to make it a little bit more complicated. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 5 this morning, where Jesus starts to teach about this sixth commandment, do not murder. So if you will, turn there in your Bible. You can find them on our notes through that QR code. If you want to throw that back up on the screen real quick, it's going to be a second before we start reading. All of the sermon notes are right there for you to follow along with, and you'll be able to read right along with what we're talking about this morning. But since we took a break from the first five, I want to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to even why we need to study the Ten Commandments. Why do we even have them? And it all starts with sin. We all need to know what sin is. Because when God created people, it didn't take us long to figure out how to sin. But the problem was, from the very beginning, it was hard to figure out what sin was. You see, sin in its most basic form, if you're studying the word that we translate as sin, it's an archery term. It's a word that they would use when they were, pulling an arrow back. This is something I also know a great deal about, archery. You let loose the arrow, and as the arrow is flying towards the target, if you hit the target, great. If you miss, they would use that word for sin. And so sin is this archery term, which means to miss the mark, to miss the target. So God, when he created us, he created this target of the way we're supposed to live. He created this mark that we're supposed to hit, and when we miss, we know that that is sin. So basically, anything that God did not design us to do, we can simply say that's sin. But the problem with us humans is when you make something simple, we find ways to screw it up. Some of us like to make a really big target so it's easier to hit. Some of us like to make a little bitty target so it's harder to hit. And so God had to institute a number of rules, a number of laws, which we see in the Ten Commandments, which we can also find in Leviticus, that are just tons and tons of rules outlining what the target looks like. It's very descriptive if you've ever read Leviticus. There are tons and tons and tons of rules that help us see why the rules are the way they are. It helps us really define what that target looks like. God got into great detail at this point, but we simplify most of those rules within the Ten Commandments. And so you see stuff like do not murder. We'll talk about not lying. We'll talk about not coveting. We'll talk about we've already talked about the first five, where you're not supposed to have any other gods before our God, so on and so forth. All of these rules can kind of be summed up in those 10. So what Jesus does in Matthew chapter 5 is, this is the most famous sermon. He actually quotes a lot of these 10 commandments in this sermon in Matthew chapter 5. First and foremost, he mentions this one about not murdering. But what Jesus does is he takes what I thought was a simple idea, and it seems like he makes it more complicated. So let's read this together, and then let's break this down. This is, again, Matthew chapter 5. We're going to start in verse 21. Here's what he says. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. And whoever murders will be liable to judgment. That's what we just talked about. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Now, I thought we were trying to make this simple. I thought God didn't want us to sin. I thought God wanted us to be able to easily hit the mark, and most of us had it down when it was simply do not murder. But now Jesus is saying that anyone who is simply angry is liable to the exact same judgment of someone who commits murder. And so what Jesus says right in the very beginning is that being angry is like murder. That seems really harsh. It seems really unfair. I was angry this morning. I told Rob, I don't want to preach about stuff like this anymore because Satan tests me as I'm coming to church. Everything that I would normally do on a typical Sunday did not work. My alarm didn't wake me up on time. The McDonald's that I always stop at and get my sausage biscuit and small Diet Coke was closed when it's always open. Then, on my way down Nicholasville Road, I literally hit every red light but one. You want to talk about a trifecta of stuff that's going to make me angry on a Sunday morning? That'll just about do it. And I think that's true for a lot of us, though. There's a lot of simple things that happen in our lives that will make us angry. I mean, anybody that's ridden with me at almost any point in my life will tell you, traffic will make me angry. And do I really have to be punishable to death of sin, from sin, all because I'm just a little bit mad that the person in the far left-hand lane knows they should be driving in the far right-hand lane but chooses to drive slow in the left-hand lane? That just doesn't seem fair. So Jesus is setting this super high standard that I feel like none of us are really able to follow because, again, we as humans, we get angry about silly, stupid things. So why do I have to suffer judgment for simply being angry? Well, he gives us a little bit of the why after this. I'm going to go back and read verse 22, except I'm going to read it in its entirety, and we're going to see that there's a few reasons why Jesus says you need to not be angry. Here's what it says. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says you fool will be liable to the hell of fire. So if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. And so what Jesus is telling his people here is that recognize that when you're angry, you're really going to struggle with worship. Because that was one of their primary forms of worship. They would come and they would sacrifice. They would give their sacrifice on the altar, and that was one of their main forms of worship and showing God how great and glorious he is and ask him for forgiveness of the sins that they had committed. However, what Jesus is saying is the problem, when you're angry, you can't worship the way you're supposed to worship. You don't really focus on worshiping me in those moments. You're instead so focused on your anger and the stuff that made you mad, you can't truly worship. So part of the reason that Jesus is setting this super high standard is because he wants his people to realize that you've dedicated one day for me. We talk about it in the first part of the Ten Commandments, that the Sabbath is supposed to be a holy day. And you can't keep the Sabbath if you're angry, especially if you're angry with somebody you're supposed to be there worshiping with. This is what happens to us when we get angry. How many of you guys have had some kind of fight or some type of frustrating conversation on your way to church on Sunday morning? And once you get there, you realize that you're not at all thinking about the words you're singing. You're not focused on the message that's being preached. Instead, you're worried about the conversation you just left from the car. Or maybe you had a really frustrating and angry weekend where nothing in your life seemed to be going the way you wanted it to go. Were you focused on worship the next day? Was it a break for you? Or were you lost in your anger? You see, I think the problem that we struggle with as Christians is we don't recognize what anger does for everyone else around us. We just like to sit in our anger, and ultimately, sinful anger leads to hypocrisy. It's not just something where it distracts us from worship. Yes, that's part of it. But then on top of that, probably the reason that so many people call Christians hypocrites is because they see us in our most angry moments. They see us in the moments where we just lose ourselves completely. I've heard multiple people throughout my life say that I lost my religion on somebody when they talk about how they were angry and they give somebody some words maybe they didn't think they should be saying. You see, in our fits of anger, we become hypocrites because we no longer look like Jesus. We look like the king of evil instead of the king of glory. That's exactly what we're not supposed to do. We are supposed to look like Jesus and like nobody else. So we look like hypocrites. Not the goal. So where do we go then? How do we deal with this? Should I now give you 5 steps to avoid anger in your life? 5 ways to no longer be angry? No, because again, I don't think that's going to help anyone. 5 steps to be angry. I don't think I read right after Jesus said that 5 easy ways to not be angry at your family members. No, it's definitely not in there. So what do we do then? How do we move from being people who are angry to people who are like Christ? Well, the best way I can sum it up for you is through the life experience that I've had. When I was in college, I was a pretty angry person. I was a pretty angry person in high school. I got angry over the stupidest things. In fact, while I was at KCU playing football, I worked really hard from my freshman year to my sophomore year because I made a position change and I really, really, really wanted to get to the point where I was playing, where I was starting. I was really excited to be a running back at KCU. I wanted to be one of the, they just started their program. I wanted to set the tone for who was going to be the leading rusher all time at KCU. So I worked really hard that summer. I lifted a lot of weights. Somehow I got faster in that moment. And when we got to spring practice, or when we got to fall practice, I was one of the best performing players in practice. In fact, I sat in tons of meeting rooms with my fellow running backs where our coach told everybody in the room that Dawson's the only person who's running the plays correctly. He's the only one that is doing exactly what we've taught you all to do, to which I wore that as a badge of honor. I had the best stats in practice. I had the most rushing yards in practice of all the running backs. But when the game came, I never got above third string. Somebody started the game, there's somebody else that came in after him, and usually somebody else who came in after that guy before I ever even got the chance to play. And I'll be honest, it made me so angry. I was the one putting in the work. I was the one who stayed before practice, who stayed after practice, who was trying to set the tone for everybody else. I thought I was the one who was doing everything the right way, and yet I was the one who didn't get to start. I barely even got to play. And it made me so angry. But then, after my sophomore year, in the summer going into what would have been my junior year, I went on a mission trip. And suddenly, my world was turned completely upside down. I got to see what poverty was really like. And it wasn't just like the videos of the infomercials you see on TV. It wasn't the way that people had described it to me in movies or TV shows. I actually got to see it with my own eyes. I got to smell it with my own nose. And I just remember that whole trip that I was sick to my stomach because of the way that I had lived up to that moment. I had been so busy being angry about the stuff that I wanted that I got lost in trying to be like Jesus. And so suddenly my life took a complete shift going into what would have been my junior year at KCU. And I transferred to Johnson University. It was Johnson Bible College at the time. And I still decided that I wanted to play a sport. I decided to play basketball. I wanted to play at a KCU, but that was a whole other issue that made me angry. So I come to Johnson University. I start to play basketball. But suddenly, when I don't start, when I don't score a lot, when I come off the bench, I wasn't angry anymore. Because suddenly I realized that Jesus really didn't care about sports the way that I did. Jesus didn't care about basketball the way that I did. Jesus didn't care about football the way that I did. In fact, a lot of the things that I had serious passions for before, Jesus didn't care a lot about those at all. And I realized it was on that mission trip that I needed to live my life to try to look more and more like Jesus. And so the answer to how do I stop being angry is not a laundry list of what not to do, which is what we treat the Ten Commandments as most of the time. We look at it as, okay, I shouldn't do this, I shouldn't do this, I shouldn't do that. Instead, what Jesus is trying to show us when he brings this up in Matthew chapter 5 is we're supposed to start looking a little bit more like him, which makes so much more sense. Because when I read that verse for the first time, when I read Matthew chapter 5, and it said that anger would lead you to the same judgment as murder, my mind instantly goes back to multiple times in the Bible where I know that God was angry. There were plenty of other times that I know Jesus was angry. I mean, there's one moment where Jesus goes into the temple and starts flipping tables. If you go back to Exodus chapter 4, it literally says that God's anger burned against Moses. And so if that anger is supposed to lead to judgment, how come God can be angry and how come Jesus can be angry? That doesn't seem fair. Is I'm supposed to look like Jesus and they're allowed to be angry, but I'm not allowed to be angry? How can I reconcile those two things? I mean, Moses was even a good guy and God's anger burned against him. How does that work? Well, that's when I went and I turned over to John chapter 2. And in John chapter 2, we find that story where Jesus is flipping tables. And there's one word at the very end that suddenly turns this whole thing around, and it suddenly all makes sense. Let me read this for you. It's in your notes if you want to follow along or on the screen. It says in John chapter 2, verse 13, the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers sitting there, and making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple. With the sheep and the oxen, he poured out the coins of the money changers and he overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Now, different versions of the Bible translate that word zeal differently. But zeal is the perfect word. Jesus wasn't necessarily angry in this moment. He had this zeal. He had this righteous passion for doing what was right in the face of evil. And so I go back then and I think about Exodus chapter 4 when God's anger burned against Moses, and I realized that Moses in that moment had questioned God about doing his will time after time after time again, as God is sitting before him in a burning bush telling him what he is going to be able to do, giving him all sorts of signs and miracles that he gets to perform in Egypt, and all Moses does is question God. And so God has this righteous anger against Moses because he's unwilling to face evil, because he's unwilling to do what he was supposed to be doing. Same thing happened with Jesus there. He walks into the temple, the house of worship, the house of prayer, God's dwelling place on earth, and he sees that it is now a den of thieves trying to take advantage of people who want to worship. And suddenly, a righteous anger breaks out, and Jesus corrects the wrong. He corrects the evil with it. And so I realized in reading these stories that yes, our anger can lead to sin, but the way we avoid doing that is we model our hearts after God's heart. Because when we do that, we start to care about the things he cares about. We start to care less about the things that he doesn't care about. Like those things I mentioned before, you realize he no longer cares about basketball. He no longer cares about football. He doesn't care what team you cheer for. He doesn't care whether UK wins or loses a game. He definitely doesn't care if Ohio State wins or loses a game. But that's the truth. There's so many things that we care about that make us angry on a daily basis that God could not care less about. God could not care less that McDonald's was closed. He couldn't care less that the red lights changed right on time for me coming down Nicholasville Road this morning. He couldn't care less that my alarm didn't go off. Those were things that made me angry, but the more that I become like Christ and the more my heart becomes like his heart, the more I start to see people differently, the more I start to care about people differently. The more I see the broken-spirited, the broken-hearted, the people who are downtrodden, the people who are probably like in eastern Kentucky right now, who don't even know where they're going to get clean water and food from next. And suddenly my heart cares so much more about those people. This is what modeling our heart after Christ looks like. It's not about a system of do's and do-nots. It's about looking like Jesus. So I'm going to ask the band to come back up. And I want you to think about your own life for a moment. Are you the type of person that gets angry over the simple things? Or are you the type of person that goes from 0 to 100 in 2.5 seconds when something goes wrong? We all get angry about different things in our lives. But the question is, do you get angry about the same things that God does? Do you get angry about the evil in our world, or do you get angry about McDonald's putting a Coke in your Diet Coke can? Whatever it might be, there are stupid things that we get angry about on a daily basis when we just need to start caring about what God does. We need to have empathy for the people who are downtrodden. We need to look for reconciliation for all people. There's someone who's made my family's life really rough over the last 6 months. But when I have eyes like God does, suddenly even I believe that those people can be reconciled. I believe that God loves those people. God has this heart for every human being to one day come back to him. That's the kind of heart that I want to have. And then suddenly I will no longer be angry about the things that don't mean anything. But I will have that righteous zeal, that passion for the things that do matter. And so this morning, I know you guys are sitting in a lot of different seats, both physically and metaphorically, because your hearts are in a lot of different places. For some of you guys, you made Jesus the king of your heart years and years and years ago. You've been baptized. You pledged him to be the Lord of your life, which is great. My question for you, if that's you this morning, is how much do you look like Jesus? Does your heart look like his heart? Does your heart chase the things that his chases? Do you see people the way that he sees people? If not, maybe you've got some questions you need to answer within yourself to look a little bit more like him. I know that I do. Or maybe you've never made Jesus the king of your heart. Maybe you have never accepted him as your Lord and Savior. And if that's you this morning, then I would love to have a conversation with you. I know Rob would love to have a conversation with you and take steps towards making him the king of your heart, because when you do, your life completely changes. It's not just about anger. Your life doesn't suddenly get easier, but you'll feel a kind of love that you've never felt before. You feel a kind of passion you never felt before. And so that's my invitation for you guys today, because most likely you're in one of those two seats. Either you need to start looking a little bit more like Jesus, or you need to make him the king of your heart. We need our hearts to look like his. So let me pray for you guys this morning. We're going to get back into worship. Lord, I am just so thankful that you are a God that seeks grace in our lives on a daily basis. Lord, I woke up ready to preach this sermon this morning, and even I already need forgiveness for the anger that I've committed. But I know I'm not alone. I know there's tons of people in this room with sin in their lives. And Lord, I just pray that you would have grace and mercy on them, but also to give us a righteous passion that when we go out of here, we will see tons and tons of people who you want to come back to you. Lord, I pray that we would be the best examples that we can be in each and every one of those situations as we meet the people around us, so that they too can come to know you and the love that you have for each and every one of us. Thank you for your forgiveness, Lord. I lift these prayers up to you, and it's in your Son Jesus' name that I pray.